Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Megan Shamus, I am the Chief Marketing Director for the FIDO Alliance, and I'm really happy to have some of our passkeys experts from the Auth0 team at Okta with me today to just talk about passkeys. And I'm coming to you live from Hilton Head, South Carolina, so forgive my lighting and my background. But I really wanted to be here with you all today, so I'm here. So often we hold a lot of educational sessions, whether in person or webcasts, and often we cannot get to all the questions that folks have. And what we've been doing, and I know that our folks from Okta here have been doing this as well, is sort of compiling some of the most common questions or misconceptions that we might hear about passkeys. I mean, we're here today just to kind of talk through that. So no presentation today. We're just going to be chatting with these great folks here. So let me just go through real quick some housekeeping, and then we'll get into it. So welcome to On24. So you'll see you have a console with some widgets. We will be leveraging the media player for the most part since we're just having a chat today. But you also have a question widget, so we should have time to answer some of your questions in addition to the ones that we've compiled. So please do ask your questions, and if for some reason we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to follow up with you later on after the webcast. You will have access to the webcast following this, so you'll receive an email directly after the webcast to give you the link to watch it if you miss anything or you came in late or want to view it again. Also, if you want to tell any folks to come in and watch it, they can just register and watch it. So it's not something you have to be here live for. And then lastly, there's a survey on the console. So please do take that survey. Let us know how you feel about the content that we're presenting. It really means a lot to us. It helps us to inform all of our educational programs. So please do that as well. So as I said, I'm Megan. Let me have our great panelists today introduce themselves. Tim, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Capelli. I'm a standards architect at Okta, focusing on customer identity. I've been working on passkeys for a while. Just want to do a little plug for the FIDO swag store, get all this fun stuff. And I'll hand it over to Carla.
Thank you very much. So my name is Carla, and I work as a senior developer advocate also at Auth0 by Okta. I'm based in Valencia, and I've been focusing a lot on passkeys for the past year or so. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't have a cool t-shirt right now to show you because it's very hot here in Spain, so going with Brandon now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brandon Simons. I'm a principal product manager at Auth0 by Okta, so I'm primarily focused on the login infrastructure. I'm calling in from relatively early and from the West Coast in the Seattle area. So yeah, looking forward to the chat today.
Well, thank you for being here in pretty much all time zones, almost. We're only missing Asia, I think, but thank you so much for being here. We'll just get into it. So often we hear a lot about just kind of fundamental questions about the tech. So passkey is kind of a new name, but not so new tech. So I was hoping you could kind of talk through how, some of the things that you've heard about passkeys from a tech perspective. What are some of the things around the transition to passkeys that you might have heard that may or may not be true? Tim, you want to start?
Yeah, I can get that one off. Yeah, so one of the most common misconceptions, right, is that passkeys are this brand new thing, and they are this proprietary technology implemented by platforms, and they're just like a big tech lock-in tactic, right? Like that's the one we probably hear the most. When I was at Microsoft previously, that's the one I heard the most, especially to folks who are new in the tech community. And so just to address some of those, right, like passkeys are the name of a credential that use all of the existing APIs that we've been building over the past 10 years, right? So passkeys use FIDO2 and WebAuthn. The big thing is like we just didn't really have a term for these things before, right? Like people maybe referred to a security key as the credential, and it's not really, it's where you hold your credentials, but it was just easy to say sign in with your security key. And then, most on the platform side, generally people refer to it as the platform branding, right? Like sign in with Touch ID, sign in with Windows Hello, right? There wasn't kind of this universal name for it. So giving the credential itself a name has been huge, very, very valuable. The analogy I like to use is, the tap to pay icon, right? While it doesn't have a name, I guess it's tap to pay. When users see that in a store, at a checkout machine, even folks who may not be as tech savvy have a good idea of what to expect and what the experience is, right? So now we have something similar on the web, and it will take time, right? Like, we don't expect users to understand what a passkey is now and maybe ever, but they should know what the experience is, right? Like, the other analogy I like to use is Bluetooth. Does the average consumer actually know what Bluetooth is or does? No, they just know it works, makes their headphones work, right? And that's okay, right? But it is important that when users are looking for the term, they can find it. And when they see an icon, a visual cue, they know what to do. In terms of the it's just proprietary platform lock-in, right? I think that sentiment came from the fact that a lot of the platforms launched the new capabilities first, right? I think that's just the nature of how things work. I think in an ideal world, we would have aligned all three tech companies and all the password managers, and everyone would have had an aligned roadmap. If you work in tech, that is nearly impossible. We can't even get inside the same company to align on a roadmap, right? So things trickled out over time, and there is a default experience on devices, right? If you think about the goal of trying to eventually get rid of passwords, users need a solution that works out of the box without buying anything, right? And so that has to be a default thing built into the device. And users who don't want to use that need to have the ability to use something else. I like to compare it to like Wi-Fi drivers, right? Like, you can't really ship a device without Wi-Fi drivers and expect users to install a pluggable version of a Wi-Fi driver. Like, that doesn't, you have to have a basic set of capabilities out of the box, right? So that is what Windows Hello is, that is what iCloud Keychain is, and that is what Google Password Manager is. And if you don't want to use those, you can go use another solution like 1Password, Dashlane, Bitwarden. There's over 40 now that are supporting passkeys. And so the other one that comes up is like security keys, right? Well, now, I invested in security keys. I want to use security keys. You can think of a security key the same way as you think of 1Password or Dashlane or iCloud Keychain, right? It's the authenticator that you store your passkeys on. There are going to be some limitations in terms of storage, right? Software has unlimited storage. Pieces of hardware have limited storage, but Yubico and Google announced new security keys that support between over 200 passkeys in some cases, and there are vendors out there that support more, right? So it's an evolution of the ecosystem. What I typically recommend to users who are more security centric is protect your passkey providers with security keys, and then use your passkey provider for your day-to-day sign-ins, right? That for consumer services, right? Do you really want to be plugging in your security key constantly to sign in? So you use security keys as a way to protect your core accounts, and then leverage kind of the technology. The last one that we hear is that passkeys are just federation, right? Because iCloud Keychain, for example, uses your Apple ID, and Google Password Manager uses your Google account. A lot of folks have said, well, this is just federation, and it's not, right? Like, federation is a bunch of transactions between multiple parties where every time you sign in, that is disclosed to the identity provider, right? So, for example, if you sign in with XYZ, every time you sign into a website with XYZ knows you signed in, right? Like, that's a huge privacy challenge that exists with consumer federation that doesn't exist with passkeys, right? So essentially, this is an encrypted blob of data that you happen to be storing with your XYZ account, right? That's it. That's the end, right? So there is a fundamental difference between federation. I personally, one of my 10-year goals is that passkeys reduce or eliminate the need for consumer federation. And there's nuance to that statement, but that's probably for another webinar.
Well, geez, there's a lot to unpack with this. Hold on. Just told us everything that we needed to know about passkeys. But okay, so one of the things that really resonated, there's two things that really resonated with me that you just said. So one, past the people's eyes kind of light up, or they nod their head when you explain, the specs have not changed. This is like consumerization of FIDO. We needed a term that would be user-friendly. And to your point, it is having a name to put with an experience. So that you see the icon, you know what the experience is going to be. And very similarly to when, again, we rolled out like chip cards in the US or contactless payments, you were talking about tap to pay. They just need to do it one time and associate it with something once or twice, and then they got it. They see it, they're going to go to another website. Oh, that's what I did on the last thing. Like that, I get it. Like I don't need to know the ins and outs of public key cryptography necessarily. Some consumers might want to know that, but many do not. But they know that it's secure and it's easy. And that's, you're totally right on that. And then the other, I love when you do the comparison about like having something that comes like in your device, like ready to go, like antivirus software or something. Like it's in there. You don't have to use that one. You can go pick another one, but it's something that's in, comes in the box, like with, some ability to use it if you want to use it. And that's what, that's why, iCloud Keychain and Windows Hello and Google Password Manager are just there. But of course, if you're a customer of something else, or you want to try something else, that's why we're, trying to facilitate this as a open ecosystem. So thank you for all of that, Tim. That was great. So this is, I get this question all the time as well. When we talk about how end users leverage passkeys, we usually say, you use the same thing that you unlock your device. So however you do that can be biometric, can be, pattern, PIN, but always, no matter, it's a masterclass, people, you get the hand up, where are the biometrics stored? Or like, what is going on with the biometrics? And so what I wanted to ask next is, what's the relationship of biometrics with FIDO and passkeys? And what are some misconceptions that you have heard about that? Carla, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, I can share some light here because I've gotten a lot of questions around this topic. Because I think to kind of connect to what Tim was saying, that the familiar has to fit, the experience has to feel familiar. I feel that usually when we're using passkeys, if you have like a modern device or a mobile phone, you're probably unlocking that, or you're using your biometrics, like your fingerprint, or maybe you're using Face ID or whatever. And so there's a lot of people who tend to think that, oh, I'm just using my biometric, right? This is the same thing. There's nothing else behind that, but there is, and there's a lot more. So that's definitely one of the biggest misconceptions that I've seen. And then also a lot of questions have arisen around the fact that, okay, but what if your device doesn't support biometrics, right? Because we usually talk a lot about that. Like biometrics are usually like a very strong factor to use, but there are definitely other ways. And I think security keys are a good example for that. You can still use passkeys using a security key that doesn't necessarily offer biometrics. And in the end, biometrics are not required unless the relying party actually demands for it. So if you're using a security key, you can unlock it with a PIN or use a pattern or something like that. So that's pretty much, like, I think, two of the main things that I've heard around biometrics and passkeys, I think.
Yeah, and I think, it's a gesture to give consent to do the public-private key exchange. Yeah. It's a local thing to the device between you and the authenticator on your device. And so we do a lot of UX research with consumers. And what we see is, especially when it's presented as, you can use however you unlock your device, some kind of concern around, well, where is this biometric going or being stored? But what we see is, once we explain in like one line, like your biometric is not being shared with the operating system, or the service, they're like, oh, okay, I definitely want to do it then because it's so easy. But there is that, you do have to kind of explain very quickly when you're introducing this to consumers that, the biometrics stay on your device.
Yeah, especially with like sync passkeys, because the name says you're syncing something, people tend to believe, oh, then my fingerprint is going to be somewhere else. Right. Or like my face is going to be somewhere else, but it actually never leaves the device. So.
Tim or Brandon, you want to add anything on the biometrics topic?
Yeah, I think Carla covered a lot of this already. I think it's just like a lot of end users no matter who they are, I kind of have a relatively mobile, modern mobile phone is used to kind of this biometrics play. So like most banking apps you open today is using some sort of biometrics, but really it's not necessarily using passkeys at all, but it's maybe unlocking a refresh token or unlocking maybe a stored password stored within the app itself. So lots of different use cases where biometrics, where a lot of users have been introduced to the fact. So for myself, I'm very eager that a lot of people are used to it. So hopefully the on-ramp for passkeys is kind of continues to get improved. So bring more users in.
Right. Yeah. So the question of, I use Face ID to get into my bank. Is that passkeys? Do you feel like that needs to be explained to consumers when they're using passkeys, when they're not, or is that just something that, we'll kind of figure out as we go?
I think from my perspective, I think it wouldn't necessarily need to explain passkeys of the technology to the end users. Is that if we can make the experience kind of seamless for the user, so it's similar to what Tim had mentioned earlier, kind of it has a Bluetooth symbol. Like, okay, I know where that button is on my phone. It's not necessarily needing to learn the technology. So definitely benefits in kind of removing the complex part of it and just making it simple. Well, difficult. It's like there's lots of work and effort goes into making passkeys as usable as it is, but I think we can continue to improve upon all these scenarios, kind of make it just ubiquitous.
Yeah, and I would just add, right, I think often local biometrics, that's how we typically refer to the native app prompt. That's typically only for reauthentication, right? That has no meaning until the user actually bootstraps the app. So it's really important, even for financial apps where there's concerns about sync passkeys, right? Using sync passkeys to initially bootstrap the app and doing something else, right? If you have very, very high security requirements that require you to do ID proofing and other things, use the sync passkey and then do something else after. The user gets this delightful sync passkey experience of the sign-in, and then you can continue using local biometric prompts for your native app because the user doesn't have to do anything. There's no cognitive decision for the user when they get that prompt, because the only thing you can do is do a biometric. And on devices that have face unlock, it's so quick, usually the user doesn't even notice it, right? So they play hand in hand, right? Local biometric prompt doesn't work on its own. It has to be provisioned and bootstrapped. So passkeys and local biometric prompt are actually perfect for each other. And if you want to just use the passkey for reauthentication, there's actually a great way of using allow lists that actually allow you to have a near identical experience that most platforms present it the exact same way. So lots of options. You don't have to throw out what you're already doing. Just replace that password that you're asking for with the passkey, and you can continue doing everything else if that's your requirement.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of like how we present this to users over time. It's like a password manager experience, but what of consumers that like haven't used a password manager before? And this is, now I'm like venturing down a different path that I'm going to get to later. But when it comes to like introducing folks to passkeys and like the tech you need for that, we talk about WebAuthn. We know WebAuthn is a web standard. So, for example, so does this mean you can only use passkeys on like websites? What about native apps? You need a phone. What if you don't have a phone? Can you still use passkeys? Can you bootstrap can you do cross device sign-ins if you don't have a phone, for example? Like these are just some of the things we get do you want to cover any of these topics? Do you hear these as well? And how would you clarify that?
Yeah, I think the first one of like passkeys only available on web. I think this is something that potentially the standards and kind of everything's been moved that way of like, oh, it's WebAuthn, but really its passkeys are now broadly available. So you're available like on Apple and Android. You can go through, they provide native applications to do registration as well as authentication for users. So this allows native app developers to essentially onboard users with passkey. And so they can get started immediately. So there's no password, no other authentication factors required other than just doing registration with passkey. And then also the subsequent logins are also available. So also the benefit with this is like once you've onboarded the users with passkey on the mobile devices, then moving to allowing that passkey to work in web, it's all transparent to the user and to the app developer as well. Also, like kind of when I mentioned a little bit of like onboarding and ramping up users to passkey, one thing interesting we've had is like a lot of users that are mobile based are familiar using biometrics or Face ID or the different modern authentication means, but granted, maybe they're only doing local authentication, but this concept that these users are used to this, so it's just and it's very common to scan your face, do your Touch ID to get authenticated, and so these are the best users to start onboarding to passkeys. From my perspective, is that they're familiar with this versus looking at the web-based flows. Those users might not be quite as familiar with Touch ID, or they might not necessarily be using the modern authenticator as much in the web experience when they're on the laptop, desktop, or they might not have the biometrics like fingerprint scanner and so forth available on them. Maybe it's an older machine with newer software. So I think when looking at kind of support for this native APIs for passkeys is really going to open up lots of avenues to start onboarding users to passkeys without maybe the more confusion that they might run into in just onboarding to web directly. So I'm very excited kind of bringing more authentication of passkeys into the native devices. I think it'll be a big win, just to help on-ramp the onboarding of passkeys. Another thing you mentioned was requiring a phone to sign in. So we talked about like maybe some scenarios you're looking to get users onboarded to passkeys, having them available with your native app is a great option. Also, but the kind of the misconception that you always need your phone to sign in. And so that's the great thing with passkeys is that most people here know is that they'll sync between the local device, they'll sync within the ecosystem, whatever passkey provider you're using, they'll sync with across the different devices if you wish. All right. So now the question of like, do you always need your phone to sign in? And so this is something that we looked at kind of when we implemented passkeys for within the Auth0 product, is that if you go through an authentication flow that requires the user to say they start the authentication flow, then they authenticate with cross-device authentication. So they use their phone to scan the QR code, go through the authentication process. This process, we identify this as, the person's using cross-device authentication, which we ask the user, would you like to create a local biometric as well? And so this will go through the process of migrating the user kind of from the phone to the web-based experience. And so that's kind of how we've looked at it, solving it, kind of make it so that passkey is much more ubiquitous to the user next time they come to the prompts and get it and to authenticate.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to add anything else on that one?
Yeah. I wanted to add something real quick regarding the having your passkey available on multiple devices. And I think some other questions that I've gotten, because I always try to showcase passkeys with the multi-device feature. One, because I think it's cool, and two, because it's cool. So when you're showcasing that, and then, for example, if you're doing that with Auth0, like Brandon said, you will get a prompt saying, oh, do you want to create a passkey on this device that you're on right now instead of on your device? And for some people, that's confusing. But once you explain it to them and help them realize that, there are some limitations about what if you don't have your phone at the time. Maybe you want to have that passkey on this device, but like another passkey on this device, and that's also a possibility. So I think that's a cool thing.
Well, that's kind of brings me to the next thing, which is like how passkeys are actually used and managed by users. We get a lot of questions. We always, in all of my years with FIDO, it's, what of account recovery? How do I get what if I lose my passkey? Can you lose a passkey? What does that mean? If you, can users delete their passkeys, and then is it just where is it deleted from? Does it live somewhere? So like these kinds of like life cycle questions, how can you kind of talk through like how this actually works today, or how like folks can manage their passkeys? And then like anything on, the idea of account recovery, is it you're recovering the account, you're recovering the passkey? Do you want to continue to have passwords to back up for recovery? So these are the kinds of any and all of these topics if you want to touch on that. Carla,
yeah, sure. I can start on this one actually, because I heard like, if I delete my passkey, am I deleting my account? And no, the answer is no, because a passkey is yet another authentication method that you have for your account. So it's like when you change your password, I don't want to really talk about passwords too much, but when you change your password, like, are you deleting your account? Are you changing your account? Not really. Your account's still there. So that's one thing. And then something else is, where do I delete my passkey, or how do I delete it? Like, how do I manage it? And the answer is that, and this was actually that for me as a developer, it took me a while to understand, but once I understood it, I was fine. So I'm gonna try to share it with you all to see if it makes sense. But so a passkey, as we've talked about, is basically a cryptographic key pair, right? So there's a pair of things. And for me to understand that, it's like, okay, so there's a part of this key that lives on the relying party, that's the server, and there's a part of this key that is in my authenticator, right? So the private key is in the authenticator. So if you want to completely remove a passkey, for example, you have to revoke it from the server or the relying party, but then you also have to go to your authenticator and remove it from there as well. So to me, that was like aha moment, and I wanted to share it. But yeah, I think the other question that you asked, or that we can maybe discuss, is like if I delete it, is it deleted everywhere? And I think it's kind of related. Like if you delete it from a server, then it's deleted from the server, but then you have to go through the authenticator and stuff.
And what, like, if you don't, what ends up happening? Does the authenticator then still think there's an account, will like prompt you to sign in, even though that passkey has been deleted from that like RP site? Like, what would happen if you didn't delete them in the places that needed to be deleted?
If the user's going through and deleting the local, if the RP side goes through and deletes the passkey, it's possible that the user would be prompted for enrolling in the passkey. So it's kind of similar of like you're attempting to log in, but you know your password is correct and you're knowing that your credentials are right, but you're still getting authentication, like an authentication error. But potentially the account got deactivated, the account got removed, deleted, so forth. Potentially just said forget my account, and that at that point then the RP would go through and remove your account, remove all information, or deactivate and so forth. So from the end user experience, then the RP would have no idea like all the different credentials you'd have and what passkey providers and so forth have been used to authenticate. There's ways to finding more heuristics on that, but not necessarily contractual ways to do it.
Yeah, on the behavior of like when you remove it from the relying party of the service and it stays on the device, right? So historically, right, this is by design. There is no direct relationship between the relying party and your passkey provider. That's why it's not federation. Right. There's no link there. What we are adding to WebAuthn, hopefully in this current release, is the ability for you, the relying party, to essentially say, hey, like these are the only passkeys that are actually valid for this account now. If you see any old ones, opportunistically remove them to like a recycle bin, let's say, right? And it's there for 30 days, right? So it's all opportunistic. It's not guaranteed, but we think it will help with this cleanup problem where a user only deletes it on the relying party, but it still shows up like in the autofill UI because again, that your passkey provider doesn't know that it was removed from the site. So that is a new feature. It's brand new. You probably won't see it this year, unfortunately. But it is something that it's probably a top 5 feedback item. And so we're addressing it via some new WebAuthn capabilities in the future.
Yeah, I think we have, or I know we have in our design guidelines, like in the meantime, some content that RPs can use, like if a passkey is disabled, send an email to remind them. There's some language that you can put in there to remind them that the passkey is still going to live within their credential vault unless they go in there and take it out. One question, this is again, like the idea of account recovery, the word account recovery kind of like, when we talk about this, it's like, it's really just credential recovery. Like the account is still living in the world. But like what actually happens if I get a new device and I got a new laptop and I want to sign into XYZ site, and I use a third-party password manager. Like, do I have to do anything except just make sure that the password manager is installed on the new device? They'll all be there, right?
Yeah. When you go through and you've installed the new password manager, similar to getting your new device on like potentially a new mobile phone or so forth, passkeys get backed up to the cloud or to the ecosystem of the passkey provider that's there. Then kind of as Tim said, is kind of like a lot of things, guidance being like store your passkeys into the passkey provider, but you can also secure that passkey provider with a security key. And so it kind of gives you the layer of security that you potentially need. So then you kind of got all of your different logins protected with a security key, kind of indirectly. And so that's something that users want to go through, get a new device, recover, or factory reset a device, get started again, because all of those credentials are stored and they're managed by the respective ecosystems. Just simply adding the app and authenticating will make the passkeys accessible.
Tim, was there anything else you wanted to add on account recovery, or Carla, before we move on?
Yeah, no, I was going to share real quickly. So once again, that's quite like it's a question that I hear often. And yeah, like you said, Brandon, is having another factor for account recovery reasons is like the best go-to. But I think for people, I've also gotten the question like, oh, but I thought passkeys was like super secure and I don't need anything else. And it's like, they are, but you know, what happens if you don't have access to it anymore because of reasons? And so that's why the using another factor is always good for account recovery.
Go ahead.
I think just around the additional factors for account recovery, I think that's something important to understand is like oftentimes you have users, you have existing users in the system already. Like you generally don't ever get to go to a system where or you're just going to take all brand new users and you know nothing about them prior. Oftentimes there's legacy systems you need to bring in, and you need to bring all of these users up to speed. And all of these users will have existing authentication methods, maybe not the most modern and most secure, but they will have something that those end users are used to. And so those something, I think we want to get more and more users moved over to passkeys, but that transition, we can't necessarily throw away all existing authentication methods and go to passkeys right away, because there's lots of value hidden in each of those credentials. For example, if they're using SMS-based authentication or email-based authentication, granted, like they might not be the most secure, but these being able to authenticate, yes, and verify this is an email that the user owns that's authenticating, so we can kind of that there's not necessarily the most secure, but that is a relatively secure way to make sure that this user is who they said they are, or at least that they own this given email address or this given phone number. And so having those different authentication methods is needed in order to potentially, as we migrate to get more of these users onboarded to passkeys, to enable more ways to verify users using the existing methods, and also they're familiar using them. And so from the business perspective, how do you ensure that your users are continuing to have a good experience? Even if you're able to monitor and make sure that they are secure, so everything is working, you might not want to rock the boat immediately with changing how they're authenticating, and just allow them to continue to go and closely monitor different aspects of their login experiences. Whereas you might have other users that, like, these are higher risk users, they need to get migrated into a much more secure, non-phishable resistant authentication factor like passkeys. So it's kind of depends a little bit on the business and which authentication factors you have, and also the migration. And then all leads into the recovery flow. So if you essentially don't have the passkey, that's like the best authenticator to have. But if you don't have it, how do you use the other heuristics and potentially the ones that they're used to get back on their feet? Tim, you want to
add I mean, like a couple of things. So yeah, no one should be running in, rolling out passkeys and killing all the authentication methods, right? Like the goal is to rapidly reduce the use of other credentials. And if those credentials are used, raise maybe some red flags, right? A user that signs in with a passkey 95% of the time and all of a sudden uses a different phishable factor, maybe you should do something, or maybe you should alert the user. Maybe so it's all about trending over time, right? Like we are honestly 5 to 10 years out from all users only ever having passkeys, right? Maybe even closer to 10 years, right? But getting users into a phishing resistant state, their accounts in good state, and starting to flag those exception use cases, right? All these other credentials become the exception. And in terms of recovery, right? There are things coming that will help, right? Like recovery, I don't think will ever be 100% solved, right? It's the one thing in identity that will never be solved. But there are things that can help, right? So we have verifiable credentials very rapidly coming down the pike, inclusive of mobile driver's license, right? For high assurance scenarios like a bank, right? Getting back into your account could mean presenting some portion, some claims from a mobile driver's license via a very similar experience as the passkey flow, right? Like we're building web APIs that kind of give you a very user-friendly way to present these types of credentials. There's also social recovery, right? That's becoming more and more popular, right? Like how can you give someone else, a family member, let's say, access as a recovery factor? This hasn't been standardized. It's something we're like thinking about, like, should we standardize social recovery, right? Some very platformy specific things do social recovery inside the ecosystem, right? Like if you have a family group, a family member could recover an account, but what does that look like at scale? Like this user can't sign in as me, but maybe they are one of two factors. They can provide a token as one of two factors, or they can sign in with their passkey for their account as one factor into my recovery. And the third one, which is an unfortunate topic, is how do you recover an account after someone passes away? That's a very, very hot topic right now. There's some work going on in the OpenID Foundation to look at that, and it gets into the social recovery piece, right? Like again, there are very specific implementations inside of account systems, right? Like very large cloud accounts have ways of granting another user inside that cloud account the way to do this. We really need to start thinking about what it would look like at scale without any individual account dependencies. Like, is this an OpenID Connect extension? There's probably something we can do with passkeys. There's probably something we can do with verifiable credentials, right? We could issue a family member recovery credential that is maybe better at surviving device loss because it's lower risk than the sign-in credential, right? So there's a lot of things happening right now, and they all, I think, it's on us all collectively to help kind of build a story around it for users.
Yeah, and I think, we talk a lot about like account recovery, the account recovery problem, but a lot of these things are like account enrollment problems. Like, how was the account created? Like, what was given at the time of an account being created? And like, there are certain kinds of services that like should have some identity vetting, and there's some that shouldn't have that, right? So like a government service, for example, you would think that like, the enrollment process should be, durable enough that, once that account is created, it can be then like recovered using those same mechanisms by which you had like proven yourself. When you get to, and like, for example, like somebody that I know just had, they were trying to go to a government service, and the account had been created with an email address that was not belonging to that person. But then every single piece of the recovery involved that email address.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no way to recover the account except to go through that like long process of like calling and dealing with red tape and things like that. So it's like, okay, well, some of that is like an account enrollment problem that needs to be
and that's also that's somewhere where that's somewhere where like this is not a single standard solution, right? Like for example, the email takeover example is exactly why, if you've heard of the shared signals framework, sorry, selfish plug, I work on that too. That is designed to allow people to notify other parties who may be using that email address as an identifier that this email is compromised, right? So there's so many different layers in this, and that's why IDaaS solutions need to start, including us, we need to start implementing or maintaining these industry interop points to allow this capability, right? Like knowing that having Microsoft, let's say, send a notification that says, Tim@outlook.com, we're seeing fraudulent activity on it, and all these other providers are using that as an email recovery flow, that probably should have some friction and maybe even be pulled out of a recovery method, right? So there's a lot of industry work to do involved, a lot of both mature and upcoming standards.
Thank you. And then, so from an implementation perspective, and Auth0 is obviously very well known for developer tools and developer enablement. What are you hearing from that community with regards to building passkey support or feedback that you're hearing on like rolling out? Any like misconceptions? Anything you want to clarify on that front?
Yeah, sure. So continue maybe with the topic of like native support, and I think we had like one misconception around that earlier. one thing that I've heard, especially working with iOS, is that passkeys don't always support web views. And there's a reason for this. So with passkeys, you can have, with iOS, you can have like embed. I always struggle with this word in English, like embedded. Is that the word? Embedded?
Embedded?
Thank you. Web views or system web views. It's one of those words, you know, there's always one. Yeah. And so this type of web view allow the app to have full control of like the context and what information is being shared. And this is cool to use if, for example, you are authenticated against a server that you own. But if you're using, for example, another identity provider, then there's probably some information there that you don't want to share. So there are some limitations there, and there's a recommendation to use instead system web views, for example. And I think probably Tim can expand on this topic because what I've heard is that, for example, system web views doesn't feel as native, but there's definitely some work going on in there to support that.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, right, of a sign-in flow for a native app, right? You have some sign-in providers like a Google, which has an SDK, right? And when you click the button, stuff just happens and it automatically works, right? Same thing with like Facebook and others. And then you have kind of the local sign-in to yourself, right? So the user has a local account. That's often handled in embedded web view because, as Carla mentioned, it can kind of be blended into your UI. Most users won't even notice that it's a web experience. And then you kind of have this the bottom sheet load, which is the system web view, which is the most capable and provides the most options because you can break out, right? So a system web view, for example, runs in the context of your default browser on the device, right? So it has all the same privacy protections, like the app itself that called it can't modify headers, it can't inject code, right? So it's effectively isolated, but it can have, let's say, state from your main browser, right? So if you're already signed into X service, I guess I'm using XYZ service, then you can get SSO, for example, right? And why that's really important in the context of passkeys is if you are offering sign in with multiple federated services, if those services then the user needs to sign in with a passkey with those services directly, right? That's not going to work in an embedded web view by design, right? We can't have a random app modifying and changing parameters that are going to a different third-party website, right? This is by design, and I know it's frustrating, but like that would be a very huge no-no from a security and privacy standpoint, right? So in system web view provides the ability that whatever you see in the top bar, right, the equivalent of the browser bar, that is the site that can request a passkey just like it works in your main browser, right? So if you're using multiple sign-in providers, you would launch that into there. Some other work is happening to converge these experiences, right? So if you haven't heard of FedCM is a new browser API similar to WebAuthn that allows these federated providers to work more seamlessly. And obviously that's a web API, but there are also platform equivalents, for example, on Android that do the same thing in the credential manager framework, right? So this is, again, all evolving and collapsing at some point into a cohesive experience. But there are solutions. They just may not be they may not be the thing you implemented previously because of these are new ways to address them.
One of the, just to add a question onto that. So one of the nice things about FIDO authentication and passkeys is when you create the passkey as a user, it's bound to the domain which it's created, which is why it's phishing resistant. But it's bound to a domain. And there are large consumer services companies, Amazon, for example, eBay, for example, that have, different geos. And then of course those domains are going to be, different based on that geo. So if I have a passkey Amazon.com, that doesn't mean I have a passkey on Amazon.co.uk, for example.
Right.
And of course, this is a security benefit of FIDO, but it's also an issue for relying parties that are rolling out passkeys. So is there anything you can talk about with regard to that? Either is there work on the spec side to address this, or anything that can help to enable these folks to roll out across geos more efficiently?
Yeah, absolutely. This is in that bucket of probably top 5 developer concerns at scale, right? One thing I want to highlight, right? The fact that the passkey is bound to an origin and that's the only one that shows up in the UI is actually more of a UX optimization, right? You don't want the user selecting a key that's not going to work. The phishing protection that's in place that I don't think many realize is that in the response to the WebAuthn, it's actually signing over the origin, and you're supposed to check that, right? And if that doesn't match, you don't let the user into the account, right? So that if we were to extend, let's say, and say that a passkey for shopping.com can work on shopping.co.uk because it's owned by the same organization, you still get the same phishing protection because you are checking in the response to ensure that this was presented on the correct site, right? So that leads to, we do have a feature we've added to WebAuthn that's in the kind of final review called Related Origins. And the idea is that as a relying party of a large multinational, you already said Amazon, but I'll keep using my shopping.com to not put them on the spot.
Okay,
Yeah, it's all right. So like if I'm a large multinational company and I am about to roll out passkeys, essentially what you would do is you would pick a common RPID, right? So if I'm shopping.com, most users especially if that's your brand name. So you are talking about Amazon, I guess. You're gonna. It's hard to duck around the butt. So you would pick shopping.com as your RPID, and then what that will allow you to do is add a well-known endpoint. So this is a web context where you add a URL to shopping.com at a predictable endpoint, and essentially you list all of the origins where you want this to work, right? And so the primary use case is these country code TLDs, right? So .co.uk, .sg, .uk, or .eu, whatever, right? So you would list all those in there, and when a user goes to those sites, the client, the WebAuthn client, which is typically a browser or the app platform, will check this URL and say, hey, is this allowed? And that will enable the passkey to be show up in a selector, right, for that site. So that's both inclusive of the autofill UI, right? So in the username field, it'll show up there, and also a modal request, which is like the selector that pops up. Now there are protections in place, right, for abuse, right? So one protection is that you can only have 5 different site names, right? So what that means in the case of like shopping.com, shopping.co.uk, shopping.sg, those are all the same shopping, right? It's shopping and then a country code TLD. So those all count as one entry. If you, for example, had another 4 sites that were not country code TLDs, let's say you have My Shopping Rewards, which is a microsite that's hosted by someone else, and you can't do a redirect or federation, that you could list that in there. You could also do like My Shopping Travel Agency, right? A lot of you can probably see the scale of the types of deployments we're talking about, where there's multiple brands running under different, slightly different origins that need to have a common sign-in flow. Now, the best practice for this is not to use this feature. It's actually to do what I would call same-party federation, right? Set up an IDP and redirect between, redirect back to login.shopping.com. That's the best practice, right? But if you can't do that for reasons, legacy, tech debt, a lot of reasons, we're hoping that this will help unblock some of these very, very large customers and help them through. So that is, as I mentioned, that's kind of in final review. There is actually one beta implementation out there already, and we expect another very large client to support that very soon. And so we hope that will unblock some very, very large customers. Now, I mentioned greenfield deployments, like planning, I planned ahead and rolled out passkeys. It can also work with existing deployments where you have already created shopping.com and shopping.sg passkeys. The one thing you will lose is like the autofill UI. And I'm not going to get too deep into that here. Feel free to ping me after. We'll have something on passkeys.dev when it becomes available. It won't be as clean, but it will at least allow the user to sign in. So.
Thank you. Again, on the developer question. So, and we do get this question a lot. You've got operating systems, you've got browsers. The supported features are they pretty much aligned across these? Is there a way for, like, how do developers know like what features are available across these different platforms in browsers?
Yeah, so some of the over time, right? Even prior to passkeys, there were a few what I would call like utility functions in WebAuthn that would allow you to call this method silently and get a response back and say whether something was supported. And it was very, very limited by design, right? So like the biggest one is if you're a developer, you probably called is user verifying platform authenticator available, super long, not easy to type, but it autofills. But that would tell you like, okay, the device the user is on is capable of creating a passkey and can do user verification. So it's essentially at a minimum has the default platform authenticator enabled, right? That was great, but that was only one lens, right? Like, so what if that returned false, right? But the user had a phone that could do passkeys and they could have used cross-device authentication. What we were seeing is RPs would just not offer the user to use their phone, right? Because they didn't have visibility into whether that flow was possible. So what we started to do was did an audit of features that we heard from developers and also saw in the spec that would be problematic. And instead of adding additional static methods like is XYZ available, is ABC available, that doesn't scale. Essentially, we added a new super method called get client capabilities, right? And when you call that, you'll actually get a list back with a bunch of features and true or false, or it won't be included in the list. And so we think that's a better solution long-term to help developers both simplify how they do feature detection, right? One example of the output you get, one of the options in that response is passkey or a passkey platform authenticator, right? So that's a generic, like, can this user be successful with passkeys either locally on the device or with their phone? And that will be like the default developer guidance for basic passkey deployments, right? Like just check for that. If it returns true, then you're good to go. Either offer passkeys for sign-in or offer the user to create a passkey. But we also added the ability to go a little deeper. You'll actually be able to see which extensions are supported if you're doing fun things with extensions. You'll be able to see whether cross-device is supported. You'll be able to see, I'm missing some things, whether conditional, the autofill UI is supported. There's also a new feature we added, which allows you to upgrade the user to a passkey silently. So essentially when the user consents in their autofill experience, right? So the user types in their username and password, or sorry, the browser autofills their username and password, and that autofill provider is configured with user consent to upgrade to passkeys where possible. And that can actually now happen automatically with the user not doing anything for low to medium assurance, right? Organizations, right? If you want full control over the enrollment experience, you probably shouldn't use that. But that's an example of a feature that would be great to know if that was supported ahead of making all this logic on your login screen. So you'll be able to check whether this conditional create feature is available. So long story short, we think this is the right way to move forward with feature detection. Not everything will be in there. All of these features we believe have a good balance of privacy and usability, right? Because it's silent, there's some sensitivity as to what we can expose there. That becomes a tracking vector. Every little bit you add on the web becomes a tracking vector. So that is done. It's in the spec. And we saw, I think there's at least one browser vendor that's already rolled it out in production. And I know of at least one more that is in testing. So, it will take a little bit of time, but we do think that's how, the developer guidance should get simpler for feature detection, and also anything new we add, like in the next version of WebAuthn, in theory, we'd be able to detect there. So we think it's a good long-term solution.
Thank you. Let's see, because we're running out of time. So let's see. Maybe you could answer this neutrally. But when it comes to like getting started, so there are, a lot of companies have like IDP. So it's, sometimes like ask them what they support, what as a starting point in like figuring out where you want to go from a solution perspective. Are there any, like how should folks like evaluate, again, this is, if you could answer this neutrally, but how should folks evaluate like whether or not like their provider is like has a solution that would meet their needs versus like going with like a new route or building or something like that, building themselves? There's a question in here, and I think it's worth, because we're always saying like how to get started, like the evaluation period, like questions like that. And I know like, so if you can address that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say take advantage of providers that have test tenants and demos, right? Like try to set it up as if you were an end user, test it with a few people around you that may not be as tech savvy. Obviously, you're not going to be able to build everything. You're not going to build a native app, but many IDaaS solutions, Auth0 included, we have starter apps, right, that you can just stand up really quick and see what the experience looks like without worrying about integrating into your app. For the most part, from like dropping passkey support into an app, there's not a lot that you actually have to do in the app, right? It's a matter of posting it to your back end and getting a token back, all of that stuff. The UI is mostly that first front end thing, so you can test it really easily with the sample app to see what the experience would be. So that would be my recommendation. And also, if you're not using an IDaaS solution, use a library. Like, please do not. We're rapidly getting to the point where we have to coin "don't roll your own WebAuthn," right? Like, we've had "don't roll your own crypto" for many years. There's great libraries out there. A little plug for simple WebAuthn. It's a FIDO conformant library that supports passkeys. It's TypeScript based, front end, back end. I wouldn't recommend diving in yourself unless you're really, really ambitious.
Yeah. I think also in part of the evaluation is looking like the passkey is, like we talked about it, we're kind of very much proponents for it, as far as like security and ease of use. Also kind of talked a little bit around the recovery process and how it's kind of potentially business specific of like how do you want the users to go through potential recovery processes and other, like using the existing factors that they use today. So it's not like there's much more involved than kind of like just adding support for a single authentication factor. Like, how do you expand upon kind of the full experience that your users will be facing? So
that's really helpful. So this is, I'm going to ask this, but it's more of a technical question. And so it's like not really like a question to end on. So we'll just try to answer it quickly so we can end on a technical question. No, but what is actually, so this is in here, and it's asked a few times in different ways. What is actually happening when you're using a credential vault to create a passkey? Like if you're on, like, let's say I'm using, Tim, I don't know, XYZ credential manager on Apple device. Who's creating the passkey? Is it Apple, or is it the credential vault creating the passkey? And like, where is that? How's that being transported and then stored?
Yeah. So your passkey provider of your choice, whether it's the native one that comes in the device or a third party, is responsible for nearly all operations. Just like a security key that you plug in is responsible to do everything, right? So when you get a selection screen, using the Apple example, right? Safari, you get a selection screen. Do you want to use 1Password? When you click on 1Password, essentially a request is going off to 1Password in the background and saying, first of all, can you create this passkey? 99% of the time, it's going to be yes. It may be that the user needs to unlock their vault, right? That's very common with third-party password managers, the vault locks. And assuming all that checks out, the passkey gets created, the response gets plumbed back. It's all kind of in the background through the platform, back through the platform APIs into Safari, into the JavaScript, and then the relying party decides how they ship the public key and the metadata back to their backend. So it's a coordination between the provider, the platform, and the caller. It might be a browser or a native app too.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Hopefully that addressed that, because that's one of we actually get that question all the time, because it's you're always taken over by the operating system to some degree. So it's like, does the operating system like see this or like have access to it in some way is the question that we typically get if you're using like a third party provider. Right. All right, so we're going to wrap up. Anything you want to share to close out? Carla, Tim, Brandon?
I would just say my pitch is always, right, like anywhere that you're using a password, you have your users using a password, there's no case where a passkey is worse, right? So just think about what that would mean for your users. Think about your SMS costs for OTPs, right? Like it's a significant cost at scale, and think about the user experience impacts of removing that password piece and account recovery flows constantly. There's so many users out there that every time they sign in, they just do an account recovery because they never set a password, right?
So you've been, in closing, you're saying use passkeys.
Yes. I wore the wrong shirt. The other shirt says that, but yeah.
Yes. And I want to thank our audience today. We had so much engagement. If we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you. And this team of experts is also, available to, ping if you have any, specific questions as well. But I want to thank you all for attending. Please do stay on to take the survey, and we'll see you on a future webcast. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.